August the 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. On this day, thousands of German prisoners of war stepped onto American soil for the first time. They had crossed the Atlantic aboard Liberty ships, leaving behind the desert battlefields of North Africa and the chaos of surrender. Now, as they marched from the docks of Norfolk, Virginia, they looked out on a sight unlike anything they had ever known. The naval base sprawled across more than 4,000 acres, cranes towering above the harbor, warehouses stretching into the distance. Yet what caught their attention was not the steel or the ships, but the glow of the city just beyond. As evening fell, the prisoners saw streets alive with light. Neon signs flickered. Electric marquees announced film titles, and theater crowds lined up outside brightly lit entrances. For men who had lived under blackout regulations in Germany since 1940, where every window had to be covered and every street lamp extinguished, the spectacle of an American city at night was overwhelming. In Hamburg, even before the war, only a fraction of homes had regular electricity. In Norfolk, every shopfront burned brightly, and theaters competed for attention with glowing letters that promised romance, adventure, and laughter. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans must be lying, that such extravagance could not exist while the country was fighting a two-front war. Yet the marquees told the truth. That week, theaters in Norfolk were showing Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and Walt Disney's Bambi. At a time when German cinemas were dominated by propaganda reels and grim news from the Eastern Front, here was an entire city openly advertising entertainment. One prisoner, Obergefreiter Karl Weber, later wrote in his diary, "We expected prisons and barbed wire. Instead, the first thing I saw was Humphrey Bogart's name in lights. I realized then that the war was lost. A nation that could waste electricity on movie theaters at night was not starving, it was overflowing." The POWs marched past the glowing signs in silence, the laughter of moviegoers spilling into the streets. For the first time, they confronted a reality that Nazi propaganda had never prepared them for. A democracy that fought wars not only with weapons, but also with culture, and with the promise of joy. To understand why the prisoners were so stunned by American movie theaters, one has to recall what cinema meant in Nazi Germany. By 1943, every aspect of German film was controlled by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. UFA, the giant Berlin studio once admired worldwide, had been turned into a weapon of the state. Film production had collapsed under the weight of censorship and war. Where Hollywood produced more than 500 feature films and thousands of shorts per year, Germany released barely a fraction. Many were historical dramas or light comedies approved for morale, but the majority of screens were filled with Die Deutsche Wochenschau. Weekly, propaganda newsreels showing German victories, often staged or heavily edited. Theaters themselves were shrinking in number. Allied bombing had destroyed cinemas in Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. By 1943, entire cities were reduced to a handful of functioning screens. When they did operate, they were darkened by blackout rules, curtains drawn tight, and often interrupted by air raid sirens. The seats were filled not with laughter, but with a population watching films under the shadow of war. Prisoners like Otto Reinhardt remembered the monotony. He later wrote that, "We saw the same reels again and again, victories on the Eastern Front, Hitler shaking hands with generals, tanks rolling across snow. But everyone knew these were lies. We were starving, our families were starving, and yet the screens showed us only glory. No joy, no music, no fantasy, only slogans." Even entertainment films carried the mark of control. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator was banned, jazz and swing were prohibited, and Disney cartoons were labeled as degenerate. In Germany, cinema had become a grim instrument of discipline. This was the world the prisoners carried with them across the Atlantic. For them, the cinema was propaganda halls, blackouts, rationing, and fear. Which is why the first glimpse of glowing American marquees in Norfolk, promising music, romance, and even cartoons, felt like stepping into another world. Only days after arriving in Virginia, small groups of German prisoners were marched through Norfolk under guard. Their destination was not a factory or a warehouse, but a movie theater. For many, it was the first time they had ever entered an American cinema. The building itself was a shock. Theaters in Germany were often modest, with a few hundred seats at most. In Norfolk, the Lowe's State Theater seated over 2,000. Its Art Deco facade blazed with neon letters announcing the evening show. Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. Inside, the prisoners confronted a palace of light. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, the lobby walls were lined with gilded trim, and concession stands sold popcorn, Coca-Cola, and candy in quantities that made the POWs stare in disbelief. One recalled later, "They sold sweets by the bucket. In Hamburg, my children had not seen sugar for years." When the lights dimmed and the projector roared to life, the impact was immediate. The prisoners were used to scratchy German newsreels, their soundtracks punctuated by air raid sirens outside. Here the sound was rich, the screen enormous, the picture sharp and alive. They watched Bogart lean across the bar in Rick's Cafe, cigarette smoke curling through the frame, as a packed American audience laughed, sighed, and applauded. For the POWs, the astonishment was not only the film itself, but the culture around it. Ordinary civilians, women in dresses, sailors on leave, teenagers holding hands, sat relaxed in the dark, eating snacks and watching a story unfold that had nothing to do with ration cards, propaganda, or war slogans. It was leisure, pure and unapologetic. One soldier later confessed in his diary, "I realized then that our defeat was certain. A people who could watch such beauty, who could spare an evening for stories, lived in another world entirely." What the prisoners saw in Norfolk was not an isolated spectacle. It was the surface of an industry woven into the fabric of American life. By 1943, the United States had more than 16,000 movie theaters, from grand palaces in New York and Chicago to small-town screens in Kansas and Nebraska. Every week, an estimated 80 million Americans, more than half the population, bought tickets. The numbers staggered the German prisoners. In the Reich, theaters had been closing under the strain of war. Bombing raids had destroyed more than 2,000 cinemas by 1943. Attendance fell as cities emptied into air raid shelters, and shortages of film stock limited production. Where Germany managed barely a few dozen features a year, Hollywood produced nearly 500 feature films annually, along with thousands of newsreels, shorts, and cartoons. The economics revealed another contrast. A ticket in America cost around 25 cents, affordable for workers and children alike. Concession stands sold popcorn for a nickel, candy bars for a dime. German theaters, when they operated, charged higher prices and offered little more than watery beer or cigarettes for sale. But the true difference lay in spirit. In America, movie-going was not propaganda disguised as entertainment. It was a national ritual, repeated week after week, regardless of class or income. Families went on Sundays after church. Teenagers crowded into matinees. Workers escaped their shifts with an evening double feature. While German cinemas broadcast speeches and war bulletins, American screens offered adventure, romance, comedy, and fantasy, with propaganda present but never dominant. To the POWs, the scale itself was crushing. A nation that could feed 80 million people into theaters weekly was a nation of stability, wealth, and imagination. One soldier remarked bitterly, "We were told Americans were lazy, but their laziness filled more seats than our discipline ever could." By late 1943, German prisoners no longer needed to glimpse American theaters from a distance. Motion pictures came directly into the camps. The U.S. military, following the Geneva Convention, allowed POWs access to cultural and recreational activities, and that included cinema. At Camp Hearn in Texas, nicknamed the Fritz Ritz, a hall was converted into a theater. Wooden benches faced a whitewashed wall, projectors whirred, and guards dimmed the lights. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time they sat in a cinema outside Germany. The films they saw were not propaganda reels, but full-length Hollywood features. The choices astonished them. Gone with the Wind, still circulating after its 1939 debut, unfolded with color grandeur. Yankee Doodle Dandy presented song, dance, and patriotism with a rhythm alien to German seriousness. Even light comedies with Abbott and Costello brought laughter into a hall filled with captured soldiers. Cartoons preceded the features. Short reels from Disney, Warner Brothers, and MGM, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, appeared in flickering light. At first, the prisoners scoffed. Some muttered that such childish nonsense was unworthy of soldiers. But as the shorts continued, even hardened veterans laughed. Watching Donald Duck wrestle with stubborn machinery or Bugs Bunny outwit pompous villains created a kind of release none had felt since capture. Attendance was enormous. At Hearn, screenings drew more than 1,000 prisoners at once, packed tightly into the hall. Across the United States, with over 500 POW camps, tens of thousands of Germans watched Hollywood films every week. The camp theaters became places not of indoctrination, but of astonishment, as prisoners discovered a culture that could project humor, music, and even criticism onto the screen without fear. One prisoner admitted years later, "When we laughed at a rabbit tricking a hunter, we forgot our pride. We realized America could afford to laugh at itself. That was more powerful than any speech." The German prisoners soon realized that what they were seeing on screen was not the work of a few lucky studios, but the product of an industry on an industrial scale. Hollywood, by the 1940s, was not just a cultural capital. It was a factory of dreams, producing more entertainment each year than the Reich could imagine. In 1943 alone, American studios released over 500 feature films. Alongside these came thousands of newsreels, short subjects, and animated cartoons. Warner Brothers turned out nearly 40 Looney Tunes shorts annually. MGM released its Tom and Jerry series at the same pace, and Walt Disney's studio produced hundreds of animated reels between 1930 and 1945. At the height of production, an American cartoon factory could complete a 7-minute short in just weeks, involving dozens of animators, musicians, and voice actors. Germany, by contrast, struggled to maintain output. Bombing raids crippled UFA studios, film stock was rationed, and manpower was drained by the front. By 1943, the Reich produced fewer than 60 feature films annually, most of them historical melodramas or comedies stripped of political meaning to keep civilians quiet. Animation was almost non-existent. Even the most ambitious German propaganda projects, like Leni Riefenstahl's productions or Veit Harlan's Jude Seuss, were rare events rather than routine releases. The difference was staggering. While Germany funneled its resources into tanks and rockets, America poured capital into both weapons and entertainment. The result was a cinema industry that continued at full pace even while fighting a global war. One prisoner, Feldwebel Ernst Kramer, noted in a letter, "We thought war meant only soldiers and weapons. In America, war also meant cartoons and musicals. They produced both as though from the same factory." Hollywood's industrial might was visible not only on the battlefield, but in every projector reel shipped to POW camps. It was a reminder that American power was measured not only in bombers and tanks, but also in stories and laughter. Weapons of morale as decisive as any division of soldiers. When the reels flickered to life in POW camps and theaters across the United States, the prisoners were not shown propaganda disguised as cinema. They were shown Hollywood's crown jewels. The effect was immediate and profound. One of the first films many prisoners encountered was Casablanca, 1942. Humphrey Bogart's weary Rick, torn between cynicism and love, struck them as a character unimaginable in German cinema. Here was no heroic Übermensch, but a flawed, reluctant man whose strength lay in compromise and sacrifice. For German soldiers accustomed to seeing only caricatures of Aryan bravery, this complexity was bewildering. One POW later remarked, "We were told Americans were simple, but this story was not simple at all. It was human." Gone with the Wind, 1939, still circulating in 1943, produced even greater astonishment. Its sweeping Technicolor images, 4-hour runtime, and colossal scale dwarfed anything UFA had ever attempted. German films of the era rarely exceeded 90 minutes, constrained by shortages of resources. Yet here was a production so vast that it seemed more like a world than a film. POWs who had lived through the firestorms of Hamburg and Cologne watched in silence as Atlanta burned across the screen. Other titles followed quickly. Yankee Doodle Dandy with James Cagney presented patriotic song and dance numbers that defied German seriousness. The Maltese Falcon introduced prisoners to American noir, where greed, deception, and moral ambiguity replaced the moral certainties of Nazi cinema. Even Abbott and Costello comedies, dismissed at first as childish, soon had entire barracks roaring with laughter. Attendance was mandatory in some camps, optional in others, but almost always crowded. At Camp Hearn, screenings drew over 1,200 prisoners at a time. In Nebraska, guards reported that German POWs requested repeat showings of Casablanca until the reels wore thin. For men used to sitting in blackout cinemas watching endless war bulletins, these films were not just entertainment. They were revelations. A diary entry from Unteroffizier Hans Becker captured the feeling. "For 2 hours, we forgot we were prisoners. We were not soldiers or enemies. We were simply men in the dark, watching a story." Before the feature film began, the lights would dim and a shorter reel would roll across the screen. For German prisoners, these moments produced some of the greatest surprises of all: American cartoons. They had grown up in a culture where animation barely existed. The Reich produced a handful of experimental shorts, but nothing that compared to the output of Disney, Warner Brothers, or MGM. Many POWs had never even seen a fully animated story. What appeared before their eyes in Texas, Oklahoma, and Virginia seemed like magic. Mickey Mouse chased across the screen with squeaky bravado. Bugs Bunny chewed a carrot and outwitted pompous hunters. Popeye, fueled by spinach, sent enemies tumbling with comic violence. The characters moved with fluidity and color far beyond the clumsy German attempts at animation. Each cartoon was a burst of energy, irreverence, and joy. At first, the reaction was skepticism. Older officers muttered that such childishness was beneath soldiers. But within minutes, even hardened veterans were laughing. The absurdity of Donald Duck fighting his own alarm clock or Daffy Duck's manic energy dissolved the grim seriousness instilled by years of propaganda. In the darkness of POW camp halls, laughter broke out, genuine, unrestrained, and shocking to men who had been trained never to appear foolish. The numbers behind these shorts underscored the cultural gap. By 1943, Disney had already produced more than 400 animated films, including Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first full-length color animation in history. Warner Brothers released nearly 40 Looney Tunes cartoons annually. MGM produced Tom and Jerry shorts at a similar pace. Germany, by contrast, produced fewer than a dozen animated reels during the entire war. One POW later recalled, "I could not believe they wasted such effort on drawings. But it was not waste. It was power. It showed us a people who could laugh even during war. We had forgotten how." The greatest astonishment came when prisoners saw not just black and white cartoons, but full Technicolor animation from Walt Disney Studios. In Germany, almost all films were monochrome. Only a handful of propaganda epics experimented with color, and these were rare spectacles reserved for party elites. For ordinary soldiers, the moving image was nearly always a gray world. Then the reels of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs appeared. Released in 1937 and still circulating widely during the war, it was the first full-length animated feature in history. POWs sat in stunned silence as colors filled the screen. Vivid greens of forests, glowing reds of apples, the shimmering blue of water. The dwarfs sang, the queen transformed, and the story unfolded with a richness unimaginable in Germany's rationed cinema. When Bambi appeared in camp screenings, the effect was even greater. The naturalistic animation of animals, the play of light across meadows and storms, the tenderness of scenes between mother and fawn, all of it seemed to belong to a different civilization entirely. A soldier from Saxony wrote later in his notebook, "It was not propaganda, not orders, not slogans. It was beauty. We sat like children, watching color on a wall, and for a moment, we forgot the war." The numbers behind Disney's achievement were just as overwhelming. Snow White had taken more than 750 artists and 4 years of labor to complete. It grossed over $400 million in today's value, making it the most successful film of its time. By 1943, Disney had produced hundreds of shorts and several features, supported by an army of animators, musicians, and technicians. For the German prisoners, the contrast was unbearable. Their homeland produced grim newsreels and wooden melodramas. America produced forests of color and animals that wept. It was not merely entertainment. It was proof of an industrial society so secure in its abundance that it could devote its energy to art that touched even its enemies. By 1943, Hollywood was not only producing entertainment, but also joining the war effort in its own way. For German prisoners, the most disorienting moments came when cartoons and short films turned their own leaders into the butt of jokes. In one Warner Brothers short, Der Führer's Face, Donald Duck dreamed he was a factory worker in Nazi Germany, forced to salute portraits of Hitler with every motion until he collapsed in exhaustion. The satire was biting, the animation exaggerated, and the absurdity undeniable. The short went on to win an Academy Award in 1943. When it appeared before POW audiences in the United States, reactions were mixed. Some laughed nervously, others clenched their fists in silence. Other shorts from Warner Brothers caricatured Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo as buffoons. Bugs Bunny donned a helmet and mocked Axis soldiers with ease. while Popeye's enemies resembled goose-stepping soldiers with ridiculous accents. To men raised on strict loyalty and fear of authority, the sight of their leaders transformed into cartoons was destabilizing. In Nazi Germany, satire against the regime was punishable by prison or death. In America, cartoons broadcast mockery to millions in theaters every week. The prisoners understood the difference immediately. A nation that could laugh at its enemies and at itself had a confidence the Reich could never match. One POW later admitted, "We had been told that discipline was strength, but when we saw them laugh at Hitler, we realized their laughter was stronger." The statistics added weight to the shock. Between 1941 and 1945, American studios produced more than 1,200 animated propaganda shorts, many shown before features across 16,000 theaters. Germany produced almost none. In the Reich, leaders demanded obedience. In America, leaders became punchlines, and the nation only grew stronger for it. When the reels turned to musicals, the German prisoners entered territory that felt even more alien. In Germany, film was heavy with duty. Historical dramas, nationalist tales, or the occasional sentimental comedy meant to distract without offending the party. But in America, the screen burst with song, color, and movement that seemed almost impossible in wartime. They watched James Cagney tap dance across the stage in Yankee Doodle Dandy. They saw Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers glide in perfect synchrony, their bodies moving with an ease that defied gravity. Busby Berkeley's elaborate choreography filled the frame with hundreds of dancers arranged like living kaleidoscopes. Even in the middle of 1943, as American soldiers fought in Sicily and Guadalcanal, the home front filled theaters with spectacle and joy. The numbers were as stunning as the images. Between 1940 and 1945, Hollywood released more than 150 musical features, alongside dozens of shorts and performance reels. Orchestras recorded scores with full brass and string sections, while studios employed thousands of choreographers, set designers, and costume makers. In Germany, musicians were conscripted, theaters destroyed, and resources redirected to the front. The idea of devoting manpower to synchronized dance was inconceivable. For the POWs, the shock was not only in the scale, but in the mood. These films radiated confidence, pleasure, and a sense that life was meant to be enjoyed, not endured. Soldiers who had marched through North Africa, surviving on thin soup and sandstorms, now sat watching American audiences laugh, applaud, and hum melodies on their way out of the theater. One corporal later confessed, "We thought it was weakness, this singing. But when a people can sing in the middle of war, it is strength." Another genre that bewildered German prisoners was the Western. In Germany, historical films had been designed to glorify emperors, Prussian discipline, or the supposed destiny of the Reich. In America, history was retold on horseback, with cowboys, sheriffs, and outlaws riding across vast open landscapes. The POWs watched as John Wayne strode through dusty towns, revolver at his side, embodying a rugged individualism far removed from the collectivist spirit of the Wehrmacht. They saw settlers push wagons across plains, families defend homesteads, and lawmen confront outlaws under endless skies. For Germans accustomed to cramped European fields and bombed-out cities, the sheer scale of the frontier was staggering. The numbers behind the genre underscored its importance. By 1943, Westerns made up nearly 1/4 of all Hollywood releases, with dozens produced each year. Small studios churned out quick, low-budget B-Westerns, while major studios crafted epics that filled the largest theaters. American audiences could not get enough of them. Children played cowboys in the streets, and comic books carried the same frontier myths, To the prisoners, the message was unmistakable. America defined itself not by ancient empires, but by wide horizons and self-made heroes. The myth of the West projected resilience, mobility, and optimism. It suggested that America's identity was rooted not in conquest abroad, but in the conquest of its own wilderness. Unteroffizier Otto Reinhardt later reflected, "We had our legends of kings and knights. They had cowboys, and somehow their cowboys seemed more real." The Westerns convinced many prisoners that America was not simply rich in resources, but also rich in stories that gave ordinary people a sense of destiny. In a war fought with tanks and aircraft, the cowboy with a rifle became another kind of American weapon, a cultural myth that carried as much weight as any battalion. Before every feature, American audiences were shown newsreels. For German prisoners, these short films revealed a difference that cut deeper than even cartoons or musicals: honesty. In Nazi Germany, the Deutsche Wochenschau was the voice of the state. Every reel showed Hitler shaking hands with generals, triumphant troops marching through conquered cities, and carefully edited battles that never admitted defeat. Even as Stalingrad collapsed in February 1943, the reels spoke only of strategic withdrawals. The truth was hidden behind triumphant music and martial slogans. In America, the newsreels looked different. Companies like Movietone and Paramount produced weekly updates that showed both victories and setbacks. Prisoners saw Allied troops landing in Sicily, but they also saw funerals of American soldiers. They watched Roosevelt give speeches about rationing and production, openly admitting difficulties. Even strikes in Detroit's factories appeared on screen, presented as part of the national story. For the POWs, this openness was incomprehensible. Why would a government allow its people to see problems? Why would it show grief, shortages, or political arguments? Yet the American audiences around them watched calmly, then turned their attention back to the feature film. The scale was immense. By 1943, more than 40 million Americans viewed newsreels weekly. Projectors delivered updates from every front within days, far faster than German propaganda could respond. And because multiple companies produced them, the tone varied, some patriotic, some somber, some even critical. One prisoner, Lieutenant Friedrich Heller, later wrote, "In Germany, truth was hidden to protect morale. In America, truth was shown, and morale seemed stronger for it." The POWs began to realize that cinema here was not only entertainment, but also information, and that democracy trusted its citizens with images the Reich would have banned outright. If the films themselves were astonishing, the behavior of the audiences was even more so. In German cinemas, silence was enforced. Ushers patrolled the aisles, and any sign of laughter at the wrong moment could draw suspicion. People filed in, sat stiffly, endured the propaganda reels, and left quickly when the lights came up. In America, the movie theater was alive. Prisoners sat among civilians in Norfolk, or watched them from the back rows under guard, and saw a culture of freedom on display. Families arrived with children tugging at their parents' hands. Teenagers bought popcorn and Coca-Cola at concession stands, carrying paper bags and glass bottles back to their seats. The smell of butter and candy filled the air, an extravagance to men whose homeland rationed sugar and butter to crumbs. During the films, the audiences reacted openly. They laughed loudly at slapstick, sighed during love scenes, and cheered when heroes triumphed. In cartoons, entire rows of children shouted back at the screen, joining Bugs Bunny in taunting his enemies. To German POWs, this casual noise was startling. In their culture, such behavior would have been condemned as disorder. In America, it was celebrated as part of the experience. The sheer abundance at the concession stands revealed another side of American power. In 1943, theaters sold more than 500 million pounds of popcorn nationwide. Sugar rationing was in effect, yet candy production for civilians still exceeded anything Germans could imagine. Coca-Cola operated 64 bottling plants for the U.S. Army alone, while theaters served it in every town. One POW later confessed, "I could not decide which was more incredible, the film on the screen or the people around me, laughing, eating sweets, and living without fear." To the prisoners, the audience itself became part of the lesson. Cinema in America was not a duty or a tool of control. It was leisure, ritual, and joy, shared by millions every week. As weeks passed, the POWs began to realize that cartoons were not occasional novelties, but a constant feature of American cinema. Every show, in every theater, in every camp, began with animation. Mickey, Donald, Bugs, Daffy, Popeye, Tom, and Jerry. A parade of characters so numerous that the prisoners wondered how a single nation could invent so much. The numbers told the story. Between 1939 and 1945, Walt Disney Studios alone produced over 300 shorts, in addition to features like Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi. Warner Brothers released nearly 40 Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons annually, introducing Bugs Bunny in 1940 and Daffy Duck soon after. MGM's Tom and Jerry series added another 30 films a year, each meticulously animated. By the mid-1940s, American studios were releasing well over 150 animated shorts annually, an industrial rhythm matched by no other nation. Germany, by contrast, produced almost nothing comparable. A handful of experimental shorts existed, but Nazi authorities considered animation frivolous. Film stock was too valuable to waste on childish art. What few reels emerged were clumsy and humorless, quickly forgotten. To the prisoners, the sheer flood of American animation was a revelation. Even more shocking was the production method. American studios employed armies of artists, writers, and musicians. A single 7-minute cartoon might require hundreds of thousands of hand-drawn frames and a full orchestra to score the soundtrack. Yet in America, these films were produced with regularity, released nationwide, and treated as routine entertainment before the main feature. One POW, Gefreiter Wilhelm Koch, wrote later, "In Germany, only war was mass-produced. In America, even laughter was manufactured by the ton, and it worked." The prisoners began to understand that cartoons were not just diversions. They were symbols of a system so rich in resources that it could devote entire factories to comedy and still have plenty left for tanks, planes, and ships. The prisoners expected Hollywood to present only strength and glory, just as Goebbels demanded of German cinema. Instead, they encountered films that revealed America's own problems, openly and without apology. In some camps, screenings included The Grapes of Wrath, 1940, John Ford's adaptation of John Steinbeck's novel. POWs sat in silence as the Joad family wandered dusty roads, their lives shattered by the Great Depression. They watched American poverty, hunger, and injustice play out on the screen. To German eyes, it seemed impossible. Why would a nation admit such weakness to its own people, much less to the world? But the film had already won international acclaim and even an Academy Award. American audiences respected it not for glorifying the nation, but for its honesty. To the prisoners, this was incomprehensible. In Germany, showing starving families would have been banned as defeatism. In America, it was art. Other films reinforced this impression. Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, depicted corruption in politics. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, 1940, mocked fascism with biting satire. Even comedies made fun of American soldiers, workers, and politicians. The numbers highlighted the difference. By the early 1940s, nearly one-third of Hollywood films dealt with social issues, personal struggles, or political themes. In Germany, 0% of cinema criticized the state. All productions, even light entertainment, required approval from the Ministry of Propaganda. For some POWs, this self-criticism was more destabilizing than any cartoon. Unteroffizier Karl Reinhardt later recalled, "When I saw America showing its failures on screen, I realized they had nothing to fear. Only a strong nation can admit weakness." In that moment, many prisoners began to sense that democracy's power did not lie only in abundance, but in confidence. The ability to confront flaws openly and still emerge stronger. For many German prisoners, the most unforgettable shock came not from the films themselves, but from the buildings that housed them. American movie theaters were not simple halls. They were palaces. In cities like Norfolk, Dallas, or Chicago, theaters seated thousands. Their facades glowed with neon. Towering marquees spelled out titles in letters taller than a man, and ticket booths shone like jewels under electric lamps. Inside, chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with murals of stars and clouds. Lobbies were lined with marble, gilded trim, and sweeping staircases. Even in smaller towns, theaters carried Art Deco designs that felt closer to opera houses than village cinemas. By 1943, the United States counted more than 16,000 movie theaters nationwide, many of them built during the boom years of the 1920s and 1930s. In contrast, Germany had fewer than 7,000 functioning cinemas, and hundreds of those had been destroyed or damaged by Allied bombing. Theaters that survived were stripped of luxury, their walls cracked, their interiors darkened by blackout curtains. Prisoners who entered American theaters for the first time described the sensation as stepping into another civilization. Feldwebel Heinrich Adler later wrote, "We had been told America was a land of crude factories and chaos, but I walked into a theater in Virginia, and it was more magnificent than any hall in Berlin, and it was for ordinary people, not the Führer." The abundance extended even to amenities. Air conditioning cooled the auditoriums during sweltering summers, a luxury so rare that one American sergeant apologized when a unit malfunctioned during a screening for POWs. Germans who had lived without heating in ruined homes sat astonished in cool comfort, watching films in perfect projection. To the prisoners, these palaces of light symbolized more than entertainment. They were proof that America could afford to devote architecture, electricity, and craftsmanship not to monuments of power, but to leisure for ordinary citizens. Not every reel was light-hearted. By 1943, Hollywood had joined the war effort in earnest. German prisoners often found themselves watching films that directly addressed the conflict they were part of. Yet the tone was unlike anything they had known under Goebbels. One example was Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, commissioned by the U.S. government, but produced with the same artistry as Hollywood features. The films explained America's role in the war with maps, narration, and captured footage. They were propaganda, yes, but delivered with clarity rather than shrill slogans. The POWs noted that the audience in the theater seemed informed, not indoctrinated. Then came satire. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, 1940, still in circulation during the war, left German prisoners speechless. On screen, Chaplin lampooned Hitler as a buffoon, his speeches reduced to gibberish, his strut exaggerated into comedy. The film openly mocked fascism in a way no German would have dared. For many prisoners, it was the first time they realized their leader was a subject of ridicule abroad. Some were furious, others quietly laughed, but all were unsettled. The contrast was sharp. In Germany, war films like Stukas or Kohlberg glorified sacrifice and discipline. They showed noble soldiers, invincible armies, and eternal loyalty. In America, war films blended seriousness with entertainment, instruction with humor. Even cartoons joined the fight, showing Donald Duck or Bugs Bunny outwitting Axis leaders. The scale was immense. Between 1942 and 1945, Hollywood produced more than 500 war-related films and shorts, from comedies to documentaries. These filled theaters across the nation and were exported worldwide. German POWs realized they were watching a cultural front as vast as any battlefield. Unteroffizier Franz Müller later admitted, "Their propaganda was dangerous because it did not look like propaganda. It looked like truth or laughter. That was harder to resist than orders barked by Goebbels." For many German prisoners, the astonishment of American cinema was too great to remain unrecorded. Diaries, secretly kept despite regulations, reveal the raw impressions of men struggling to reconcile what they saw on screen with the ideology they had carried across the Atlantic. Obergefreiter Otto Reinhardt, captured in Tunisia and sent to Camp Herne, filled the margins of a smuggled notebook with observations. In Germany, he wrote, "The screen speaks with one voice, always the parties. Here it speaks with many voices. Comedians, lovers, fools, heroes. They even laugh at their leaders. I cannot imagine this under Hitler. It would mean prison." Another entry from Lieutenant Karl Weber described his shock at cartoons. "I thought it was childish nonsense. Then I laughed until my stomach hurt. I had forgotten the sound of my own laughter." He confessed that he feared discovery, not by the guards, but by his fellow officers, who might see amusement as weakness. Feldwebel Ernst Kramer, writing in 1944, described the musicals, "The women in these films sing as if the war does not exist, but it does exist, and still they sing. Perhaps that is the point." Historians who later uncovered these documents in the National Archives noted how quickly prisoners abandoned propaganda clichés. Within months of captivity, their writings shifted from defiance to fascination. Instead of writing about German victories, they recorded impressions of Bogart, Chaplin, and Mickey Mouse. One of the most striking testimonies came from Unteroffizier Hans Becker, who simply wrote, "For 2 hours I was not a prisoner. I was a man in the dark, watching stories." These words, scribbled in secret, testify to the psychological power of cinema, not as indoctrination, but as revelation. By 1944, American authorities began to notice something remarkable. Cartoons and comedies, meant merely as light diversion, were achieving what pamphlets and lectures rarely could. They eroded Nazi discipline from the inside. The Special Projects Division, which oversaw prisoner re-education, reported that even the most hardened officers struggled to maintain composure after screenings of Bugs Bunny or Donald Duck. Soldiers who once stood ramrod straight in formation were caught quoting cartoon catchphrases or humming musical numbers as they left the theater. The rigid seriousness of the Reich could not withstand the steady drip of laughter. Psychologists later called this ideological collapse by ridicule. In Germany, authority was sacred and untouchable. In America, it was lampooned weekly in theaters across the country. Watching their leaders turned into comic figures, Hitler as a sputtering clown, Mussolini as a bumbling oaf, stripped away the aura of fear that Nazi propaganda had carefully built. The statistics revealed the reach. Between 1942 and 1945, Warner Brothers alone produced over 400 animated shorts, many mocking Axis leaders. Disney produced another 200 propaganda films, ranging from training reels for soldiers to satirical cartoons shown before features. MGM and Paramount joined in, creating a cultural front as vast as any battlefield. One POW, Unteroffizier Wilhelm Lang, later confessed, "A leaflet dropped from the sky we could ignore, a cartoon we could not. It slipped past our defenses. We laughed, and in laughing, something broke inside us." Laughter became more than entertainment. It was a weapon, not of destruction, but of demolition, dismantling the mythology of invincibility that had held prisoners together. By the time they returned to their barracks, many realized they had already begun to change. As months of captivity passed, the prisoners began to grasp not only the artistry of Hollywood, but also its staggering economic scale. To men raised in a Germany drained of resources, where film stock itself was rationed, the sheer wealth behind American cinema was incomprehensible. In 1943 alone, Hollywood box offices generated more than $1.4 billion in today's value, even as the nation fought on two fronts. A single blockbuster like Gone with the Wind had cost nearly $4 million to produce in 1939, more than the annual budget of many German studios combined. By comparison, most UFA features limped forward on budgets of less than $200,000, produced under the constant oversight of Goebbels's censors. Cartoons, which the prisoners first dismissed as trivial, were revealed to be industrial projects in their own right. A 7-minute Disney short cost up to $50,000 and employed dozens of artists, musicians, and technicians. MGM's Tom and Jerry series consumed thousands of painted cells per episode, yet was considered routine output. For the Reich, such spending on comedy would have been unimaginable. The numbers behind attendance were equally staggering. With 80 million Americans going to the movies every week, ticket sales were steady and reliable, a cultural ritual that funded constant reinvestment. In Germany, attendance collapsed under bombing, rationing, and despair. Many theaters were shuttered permanently. Others played to half-empty rooms. One POW, Obergefreiter Rudi Hartmann, later remarked, "We thought we had an efficient war economy. Then we saw America spending fortunes on dreams and still producing more tanks and planes than us. It was not waste. It was proof of strength. Hollywood was not a distraction from the war. It was part of the war effort. A demonstration of abundance that reached not only American citizens, but also their enemies behind barbed wire." Another shock for the prisoners was the discovery of America's star system. In Germany, actors were tools of the state, their careers tied to party loyalty and the approval of Goebbels. Few were widely beloved beyond their immediate roles, and none could rival the political figures who dominated the screen. In America, the opposite was true. Actors were larger than life, known by name, admired by millions, and celebrated as cultural icons. Humphrey Bogart's cool defiance in Casablanca, Clark Gable's charm in Gone with the Wind, Bette Davis's intensity in Now, Voyager, these were not anonymous performers, but celebrities with personal followings across the nation. American magazines and newsreels chronicled their lives. Theaters promoted films by star names alone, and children imitated them in the streets. The numbers revealed the magnitude of this phenomenon. By 1943, Hollywood studios employed over 10,000 actors under contract. The top stars earned salaries exceeding $5,000 per week, sums greater than what many German generals received in a year. Movie posters plastered across Norfolk and Dallas often carried little more than a star's face in bold letters. enough to draw thousands into the theaters. For German POWs, this elevation of entertainers over politicians was disorienting. Unteroffizier Dieter Koch later admitted, "In Germany, the Führer was the star. In America, the stars were actors, and the people loved them more than they loved their leaders." The cult of celebrity seemed frivolous, even dangerous to soldiers trained in obedience. Yet it revealed a deeper truth. American culture revolved around individuals free to play, to experiment, to fail, and to rise again. The very idea that an actress like Judy Garland could command more attention than a general was a signal of how differently the two societies valued life. For the POWs, this realization was destabilizing. In the Reich, fame served the party. In America, fame served the people's appetite for stories, and that appetite seemed endless. If the images on screen astonished the prisoners, the sound struck even deeper. German cinema under Goebbels had grown increasingly austere. Marching bands, Wagnerian scores, and patriotic chorales dominated the soundtracks, reinforcing discipline and sacrifice. In America's theaters, the music was entirely different. Syncopated, playful, and alive. Hollywood films pulsed with jazz and swing. Big bands filled the soundtracks of musicals. Brass sections roared during comedies, and even animated shorts had full orchestral scores recorded by professional musicians. A 7-minute cartoon might feature a swing arrangement with dozens of instruments, played with more energy than anything the Reich permitted on its screens. The scale of the industry stunned the POWs. In 1943 alone, American studios recorded over 4,000 separate musical scores, employing hundreds of composers, arrangers, and performers. Studios like MGM kept full orchestras on staff, ready to record at a moment's notice. By contrast, German studios struggled to assemble even small ensembles, as musicians were conscripted or fled the country. The cultural contrast was unmistakable. Where German soundtracks aimed to discipline, American soundtracks aimed to delight. A prisoner at Camp Shelby later recalled, "We marched to drums and trumpets. They danced to saxophones. It was another world. The rhythms of swing and jazz carried deeper implications. Both had roots in African American culture, music the Nazis had condemned as degenerate. Yet in America it filled theaters, carried by stars like Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman, reaching millions every week." To men raised on racial ideology, this was an unexpected lesson. The very styles their leaders despised had become central to America's cultural strength. As POWs sat in the dark, listening to trumpets and clarinets swirl around Mickey Mouse or Gene Kelly, they realized that music itself could be a weapon, not of fear, but of confidence, joy, and abundance. By the spring of 1945, the reels shown in POW camps carried a new tone. The war was shifting decisively, and America's theaters reflected it. Newsreels depicted victory parades in Paris, the liberation of concentration camps, and fleets of American bombers flying in endless formations. Audiences in Norfolk and Dallas cheered. German prisoners sat in silence. The features that followed no longer carried the tension of earlier years. Instead, films radiated confidence about the future. Musicals brimmed with optimism, romances ended in triumph, and comedies leaned into the promise of peace. The United States, even as it fought its final campaigns, was already imagining a post-war world of abundance and laughter. For the POWs, the effect was devastating. In Germany, cinemas that still operated were filled with desperation. Goebbels ordered the release of Kohlberg in early 1945, a massive propaganda epic urging the people to fight to the last. It was shown to civilians while cities burned and millions starved. In America, the screens showed joy, planning for a life beyond war. The contrast in numbers was brutal. While Germany's film industry collapsed to a handful of reels distributed in ruined cities, Hollywood released over 500 features and thousands of shorts in 1945 alone. Even with rationing, shortages, and global conflict, the machinery of entertainment never stopped. Prisoners who had spent 2 years in captivity watched these final screenings with mixed emotions. Some were bitter, others quietly admired what they saw. One officer later wrote, "The last films we saw were not about fighting. They were about living. That was their victory and our defeat." As the lights came up and guards escorted them back to barracks, the POWs knew their world had changed forever. The war was ending, but the images of America's laughter, color, and music would remain burned into memory. When the war ended and the trains carried them back across the Atlantic, the German prisoners returned to a homeland in ruins. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden lay in ashes, theaters destroyed, and film reels scarce. Ration cards dictated every meal. The men who had sat in American movie palaces, eating popcorn and laughing at cartoons, now faced streets filled with rubble and hunger. Yet they carried something invisible with them: memory. They had seen America's cinema at its peak. Thousands of theaters, endless reels of film, stars larger than life, and cartoons that turned leaders into jokes. They had heard jazz and swing, watched Bogart and Garland, and walked into auditoriums that glowed like palaces for ordinary citizens. Historians later noted that these memories became seeds in post-war Germany. Some prisoners became filmmakers, journalists, and teachers. Others simply carried stories home, telling their families that they had once seen Mickey Mouse in color, or that Americans laughed at their own politicians on screen. These stories spread across towns rebuilding under Allied occupation, blending with the Marshall Plan's material aid to create a new cultural horizon. By the 1950s, West Germany saw the rise of new cinemas and the arrival of American films in bulk. Disney features, Warner Brothers cartoons, and Hollywood epics became part of everyday life. For many, it was déjà vu. The same reels they had first seen behind barbed wire now played in their own cities. The transformation was profound. Under Goebbels, cinema had been an instrument of control. In post-war Germany, cinema became a symbol of freedom, a reminder that laughter, color, and even self-criticism were signs of strength, not weakness. One former prisoner, interviewed decades later, summarized it simply: "We came to America as soldiers of discipline. We left as men who had learned how to laugh." For them, the greatest shock of captivity was not the barbed wire or the guards. It was the discovery that a nation at war could still fill its screens with joy, and that joy could prove more powerful than fear.